Let your breathing slow. There's nothing required of you in this moment. No decision, no vigilance, no particular orientation toward tomorrow. Whatever the day brought, you may set it down here, at the edge of something very old. The voice you are following tonight is not in any hurry. The history it carries has been waiting for a very long time, and it will wait a little longer still while you find the particular stillness that comes just before sleep, when the mind releases its grip on the practical world and begins without announcement to drift. What we are moving toward is not a story in the ordinary sense. It is not a tale with a hero and a resolution, and a moral neatly delivered at the end. It is something older than that structure. Older than stories themselves, in the way that the wound is older than the word for wound. It is the account of a catastrophe so vast and so strange that the world on the other side of it barely remembered being a different world at all. And yet everything that followed, every monster, every war, every witcher who ever walked the roads of the continent in search of a contract, everything traces its root back to a single moment of cosmic rupture that the scholars of the continent call the conjunction of the spheres. Close your eyes if they're not already closed. Breathe slowly. We are going back a very long way tonight, further than kingdoms, further than recorded memory. Back to the moment when the world cracked open and something entirely new and entirely terrible poured through. Before the conjunction, the world that would become the continent was not the world that the witches were eventually built to protect. It was quieter than that, older. The elves had been here for what their oldest chronicles describe as time beyond human reckoning. Not centuries, but aeons. Not dynasties, but the slow cycling of geological ages. The dwarves had been here too, carving their halls into the bones of mountains that were old before the elves arrived. These were not savage peoples. They were ancient and accomplished and deeply embedded in the rhythms of a world that had not yet been asked to contain things it was never designed to hold. The land itself, the long sweep of territory from the Blue Mountains in the east to the coastlines of the western seas, was organized around principles of magic that the elves understood in a way that would eventually become untranslatable. The Ensader, those elves who remained in this world, carried within their tradition a relationship to the natural flow of magical energy, what they called the force, or chaos, or simply the current. That was neither the violent spellcasting of the human mages who came later, nor the ignorant superstition of the human peasantry who came after them. It was something more intimate, more patient, a knowledge of how to move with the world rather than against it. The mountains had their particular silence then. The rivers ran the colour of their beds, dark peat in the north, clay red in the lowlands, clear as glass in the high passes. The forests were older than their names, their canopies so interlocked that the light reaching the floor beneath them was green and diffuse, filtered through so many layers of leaf that it arrived as something more like memory than illumination. In those forests, the creatures that moved were creatures the world had made for itself, coherent with the ecosystem, part of the chain, strange in the way that all living things are strange when you look at them closely enough, but not impossible. Not wrong. Nothing in that world was wrong, in the way that what came later would be wrong. The wrongness is what you need to understand before anything else can be understood. What the conjunction introduced into the continent was not merely new creatures. It was creatures from ontological contexts that the continent's reality had no framework to accommodate. Beings whose basic logic was alien to the soil they suddenly found themselves standing on, whose needs and hungers operated according to rules that the ecosystem here had never evolved to manage. You're resting now. Good. Let the weight of that word, conjunction, settle into you slowly, the way cold settles into a stone left outdoors through the night. Not a battle, not an invasion, a rupture in the fabric of what is possible. The world did not choose this. It simply happened, the way all the largest catastrophes simply happen, without warning, without consent, without any mechanism for appeal. The conjunction of the spheres occurred approximately 1500 years before the events of the main saga, though the date itself is contested, as the dates of all catastrophes are contested by the people who survive them and the scholars who inherit the wreckage of their accounts. What is agreed upon is the nature of what happened, if not its precise mechanics. Multiple realities, multiple spheres of existence, each with its own flora and fauna and physical laws, briefly overlapped. The barriers between them failed, not through any act of will on anyone's part, but through some cosmic process that the mages of later centuries would spend considerable energy trying to understand and considerably less energy successfully explaining. In the time that the spheres overlapped, things crossed. Things from other realities found themselves suddenly, incomprehensibly, in the continent's world. Some of these things were small and bewildering. Insects of impossible geometry, plants with properties that had no analogue in local botany, rocks that resonated at frequencies the local stone did not understand. But some of them were large. Some of them were hungry. Some of them were built around principles of predation so refined in their original context that the continent's creatures had no evolved response to them whatsoever. No instinctive recognition of the threat, because the threat was not native to the evolutionary history they had been shaped by. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, not hurrying past it toward the monsters and the witches, and the contracts and the roads, all of which will come in their time in this long night we are sharing. But sitting with the specific quality of what the conjunction created. The continent did not become dangerous in the way that a forest becomes dangerous when a predator moves in. It became dangerous in a way that has no natural analogy, because the danger was not natural. It was the introduction of wrongness into a system that had no immune response to wrongness. The elves and dwarves who survived the conjunction were not survivors of a war. They were survivors of a world that had been, without warning, made into something they no longer entirely recognized. Humans arrived in the immediate aftermath of the conjunction, crossing from their own sphere before the barriers fully closed, another piece of the catastrophe. Though the humans who made the crossing would not have understood themselves as catastrophe at the time, they would have understood themselves as survivors, as refugees perhaps, as people who had found a new world and were doing what people do when they find a new world, which is to say, staying, expanding, and beginning the long process of forgetting that there had ever been anywhere else. The elves did not forget. The dwarves did not forget. But they were not ultimately the ones who would shape what the continent became in the centuries following the conjunction. That work would fall to the humans, and to the things the humans would eventually build to manage what the conjunction had left behind. What the conjunction left behind was a bestiary of nightmares drawn from every sphere that had briefly overlapped with the continent's reality. The ghouls that haunt graveyards and feed on the recently dead, operating according to a logic of hunger that the continent's natural scavengers do not share. The drowners that pull travellers beneath the surfaces of rivers and lakes, creatures of a drowning world whose relationship to water is predatory in a way that the fish and the reeds cannot process. The wraiths and the spectres, the Noonwraith burning in the summer heat of empty fields, the night wraith cold in the darkness of old houses. Beings whose attachment to this world is a form of wrong persistence, a refusal to leave that the world itself cannot enforce. The vampires require a particular attention, because they are among the oldest and most coherent of the post-conjunction arrivals, creatures with their own civilization, their own internal hierarchies, their own understanding of the world they had been deposited into. The higher vampires are not monsters in the way that a basilisk is a monster. They are people, in the precise sense of the word, beings with interiority, with culture, with the capacity for relationship and art, and the particular kind of long grief that comes from watching everything you know eventually die while you continue. They arrive through the conjunction into a world that had no category for them, and they have been navigating that categorical failure ever since. The Leshen are older still in their aspect, great wooden things, antlered and vast, whose presence in a forest reorganizes the forest around them, the way a stone dropped into water reorganizes the surface. They're not from the continent's original ecology, but they have been here long enough that the forest has begun, in certain places, to accommodate them, to build itself around them. There are forests in the deep north where the trees have been growing according to a Leshen's preferences for so many centuries that the forest itself looks like a Leshen's thought. Dark, recursive, organized around a logic that is not the logic of sunlight and soil and competition for resources, but something older and more internal. Each of these creatures brought with it the rules of its original context, and those rules did not vanish simply because the context had. A drowner does not stop being a drowner because the world it evolved in no longer exists. It continues to be what it is, in the environment it finds itself in, and the environment of the continent, its rivers and its lakes and its marshes, provides it with sufficient raw material to continue being what it is indefinitely. This is the specific tragedy of the post-conjunction world. The creatures did not adapt to the continent's rules. The continent began, slowly, to be shaped by theirs. When Geralt of Rivia took a contract, when he sat in the corner of a tavern in whatever village had managed to send a message to wherever he happened to be, and listened to a frightened alderman describe what was coming out of the river or the forest, or the ruins at the edge of town, he was doing the work that the conjunction had made necessary 15 centuries before his birth. The contract system, the silver sword, the signs, the potions brewed from ingredients that would kill an ordinary man, all of these were the tools of a response to a problem that the conjunction had created and the world had never successfully solved. Geralt knew this, in the way that people know things they have never been explicitly told but that their entire existence has been organized around. He knew that the creatures he hunted were not evil in the way that the villagers who feared them used the word evil. They were not moral failures. They were consequences, the ongoing consequences of a cosmic accident that had deposited beings from other realities into this one, where they would continue to follow their natures in the only world they now had access to. He killed them anyway, because following your nature is not an exemption from the consequences of what your nature does. But he did not hate them for it. That distinction between what must be done and what must be felt about what must be done is one of the things that made Geralt unusual among witchers, and one of the things that made him very difficult to live with. Ciri, who carries in her blood the elder blood of the elves, and in her training the hardened edge of the witcher's path, exists at the precise intersection of the conjunction's two great legacies. She is human and elven at once. She's a person of this world and a person capable of moving between worlds. Her power over place and time, a distant echo of the same forces that tore the spheres apart in the first place. She did not choose this. The conjunction left its traces in the bloodlines of the old races, and those traces do not ask permission before they resurface. The conjunction made the witches necessary. It also eventually made them obsolete. That story begins in the next of our long hours together. Let the image of the conjunction settle behind your eyes now, not as catastrophe, not as violence, but as a slow opening. A door between worlds that was never meant to open, held ajar for long enough that everything on both sides was changed, then closing again, and leaving the changed world to manage itself. You are warm. You are resting in a world that has, at whatever cost, settled into its post-conjunction shape. The monsters are there in the telling, in the rivers and the forests and the ruins of the continent's geography. But you are here, in the quiet, in the dark that asks nothing of you. The history will keep. The conjunction happened 15 centuries ago in the story, and the story will be here tomorrow, patient and unchanged, waiting for you to return to it. For now, let your breathing slow one more degree. Let the old catastrophe become the old story that it always was. Let the world the conjunction made dissolve gently into the dark behind your eyes. Rest. The long night is just beginning, and the night, tonight, is safe. You are still here. Good. Let your body settle a little deeper into whatever surface is holding you. Feel the particular weight of stillness, the way the muscles release when the mind has finally given them permission to stop anticipating. There is nothing ahead of you tonight that requires preparation. The next thing that comes will come gently and slowly, and in the voice you have already been following through the dark. We left the world still reeling from the conjunction, the barriers between spheres closed, the cosmic accident complete, and the continent left to make sense of everything the accident had deposited into its rivers and forests and the dark places beneath its mountains. Now we move into the specific geography of that legacy, into the shape of the fear that the conjunction created, and the way that fear settled into the continent's bones so deeply that it is still there centuries later, in the way that the people of the continent walk past old ruins without looking at them too closely, and the way they avoid certain forests after dark, and the way the word monster carries a weight in the common tongue that no dictionary definition fully captures, because the weight comes not from the definition, but from the experience. The first monsters were not metaphors. They were not projections of human anxiety onto the natural world, as scholars of a later, safer era would sometimes argue. They were real. They are still real. And the shape they took, the specific catalogue of horrors that the conjunction introduced into the world, tells a story about the other realities they came from that is, in its way, more disturbing than the monsters themselves. The continent's post-conjunction bestiary is not random. That is the first and most unsettling thing to understand about it. If the creatures that came through were simply the random biological overflow of multiple colliding realities, you would expect a kind of chaos, an impossible variety with no internal coherence, a zoo of the bizarre with no organizing principle. What you find instead, when you study the older accounts, the witches' own bestiaries, the elven records from the centuries immediately following the conjunction, the dwarven mountain chronicles, is something with a recognizable structure. Categories of creature that suggest the spheres that overlapped with the continent had their own internal ecologies, their own food chains and niches and evolutionary pressures. The necrophages, ghouls and gravers and al-ghouls, form one such coherent category. They share a relationship to death that suggests they come from a sphere where the boundary between the living and the dead was a resource rather than a boundary, where the biological process of decomposition had been colonized by predators specialized to exploit it. They are not undead in the way that the folk tradition of the continent uses that word. They are alive, fully and metabolically, in the way that a vulture is alive. Creatures whose ecological niche is the body after the person is finished with it. The ghoul does not raise the dead, it eats the dead. The distinction seems minor until you understand that the ghoul's hunger is calibrated to the chemistry of decomposition, not to the presence of living flesh, which means that disturbing the dead, burying them improperly, leaving battlefields uncleared, flooding graveyards, creates exactly the conditions under which ghouls flourish. The insectoids are another coherent category. The giant centipedes, the arachnomorphs, the andrigas, creatures that suggest a sphere where the arthropod body plan had been carried to scales that the continent's biology never achieved. They are not large insects in the way that a child might draw a large insect, simply scaled up. They are large in the way that implies their original world had different atmospheric compositions, different gravitational parameters, different evolutionary pressures that selected for size in ways the continent's conditions did not. They struggle, in the continent's ecology, with things that would not be problems in their original context. The andriga nest in the autumn, as if against a winter that does not come the way they expect. The arachnomorphs spin webs calibrated for a humidity that the continent's forests only occasionally provide. The draconids are perhaps the most studied category, because the dragons, the oldest and most coherent of the draconid lines, are intelligent enough to have opinions about their own history, and some of them have shared those opinions with the scholars who had the patience and the courage to ask. The true dragons know that they are not native to this world. They carry this knowledge lightly, in the way that very ancient beings carry things that there is no longer any point being troubled by. They are here. The world they came from is inaccessible. The continent is their world now, and they have been in it long enough that the word native is beginning to apply, however reluctantly. It is worth pausing here and sitting with something that the folk tradition of the continent never quite manages to say clearly, because the folk tradition is organized around fear rather than understanding. The monsters of the post-conjunction world are not evil. This sentence, spoken aloud in most of the continent's towns and villages, would be received with the kind of blank incomprehension that greets statements that violate the basic organizing assumptions of a culture. Of course, monsters are evil. The word monster means evil. The fear and the evil are the same thing. But they are not. This is one of the things that the Witcher tradition understood, and that the rest of the continent's culture consistently failed to absorb. The creatures that came through the conjunction were not moral agents making choices in opposition to a moral order. They were biological entities following the imperatives of natures, formed in other realities, in ecosystems with different rules, now doing the best they could in an environment that was not quite right for them. The drowner drowns people because drowning is what drowners do, because the sphere they came from was one where active aquatic predation of large surface-breathing animals was a successful ecological strategy. The Noonwraith burns in the summer sun of empty fields, because the phase of existence it is locked into requires a particular quality of summer heat that the continent, at its worst and most blazing, occasionally provides. None of this makes the deaths any less real. None of it makes the grief of the people who lost someone to the river, or the field, or the forest, any less valid. The Witcher's understanding of monster ecology is not a philosophical exercise in sympathy for the creature. It is a professional tool. The understanding that knowing what a creature is, in its own biological logic, is the most reliable way to know where to find it, how to weaken it, and how to kill it efficiently with the minimum possible risk to the Witcher doing the killing. But the Witcher's professional distance from the folk tradition's moral framework is also, and this is the thing the folk tradition never forgave them for, a form of contamination in the cultural eye. A person who does not hate the monster the way the monster is supposed to be hated is a person who has something wrong with them. A person who can look at what crawled out of the river and discuss its feeding habits with academic detachment is a person who has gone over to the wrong side of a line that the community needs to believe in. The Witcher solved the problem, but the Witcher, in solving it too calmly, became the next problem. This is a pattern we will return to. The specific textures of the continent's monster geography are worth dwelling in for a while because they are the landscape that the Witchers were made to navigate, and they have a quality that is distinct from any natural landscape. A quality of things being almost right but not quite. The specific uncanniness of creatures that belong to a different logic inhabiting spaces that belong to this one. The Noonwraith appears in the high summer fields at the hour when the light is vertical and the shadows are their smallest, and the heat makes the air above the grain shimmer like water on a hot stone. She is pale, paler than a person should be in that light, paler than anything that has absorbed enough sun to be standing in it. She moves with a quality of motion that is not quite walking, as if the rules governing the relationship between intention and locomotion are slightly different for her than for everything else in the field. In the oldest accounts, the people who survived encounters with Noonwraiths describe not the terror of the thing but the confusion, the feeling, first, that something is wrong with the light, and then that something is wrong with the day, and then, much later, after the thing is very close, that something is wrong with her. The Leshen's territory announces itself before the Leshen does. A forest with a Leshen in it smells different from a forest without one, damper and older, with a quality of decay that is not the healthy decay of fallen wood, returning to soil but something more organized, more purposeful, as if the decomposition is being directed. The antler-crowned figures carved into trees at the boundaries of Leshen territory are not warnings in the way that a human would erect a warning. They are markers of something more like ownership. The Leshen's imprinting on the landscape around it, the forest beginning to carry the impression of the creature at its centre, the way a field carries the impression of the stone that has been resting in it for a season. The vampire at rest in a city is perhaps the strangest presence in the post-conjunction bestiary, because the vampire at rest in a city is almost invisible. Higher vampires do not require blood in the volumes that the folk tradition imagines. They are not draining the population of whatever city they inhabit. They are living in it, in the precise, literal sense of the word, attending its theatres, patronizing its artisans, developing opinions about its architecture and its wine and the quality of its intellectual culture. Regis, the barber surgeon of Dillingen, spent decades as a figure of community trust. The monster that the folk tradition says a vampire must be was present in Regis. It was simply not the only thing present, and the other things present were, by any reasonable measure, admirable. Geralt's education at Kaer Morhen included extensive study of the Bestiary, the accumulated records of Witcher encounters with post-conjunction creatures, maintained in the fortress library with the particular care that people give to information they know they will someday need to retrieve in conditions of high stress. He memorized the signs of each creature's presence, the vulnerabilities specific to each category, the oils that disrupt the biological processes of creatures whose biology is not from this world. He learned to read a monster's behaviour not as an expression of malevolence but as a data set, a collection of behavioural clues that, properly interpreted, revealed the nature of the thing and therefore the method of its ending. But Geralt also learned, in the way that the best students learn the thing the curriculum did not intend to teach, that the Bestiary was incomplete in a specific direction. It was exhaustive on method and deficient on meaning. It told him how to kill a Noonwraith with impressive precision. It did not tell him what to do with the knowledge, increasingly clear as his centuries of work accumulated, that the Noonwraith was not malicious, that the Drowner was not evil, that the Leshen was not a demon, but an ecosystem in distress. The professional understanding created a philosophical problem that the profession had no framework for resolving. This is the split that defined Geralt across the saga, the gap between what the Witcher's training told him monsters were and what his own experience of monsters told him. He killed them because they needed to be killed, because people were dying, because the contract existed and the child was afraid, and the village needed its road back. But he carried with him, in the particular quality of his silences on the road between contracts, the awareness that what he was doing was not justice. It was management. The careful, endless, ultimately temporary management of a problem the world had never solved and was not in any visible way working toward solving. Ciri would later encounter creatures through her capacity to move between worlds that made even the continent's post-conjunction bestiary seem organised and coherent. Creatures from spheres that had not overlapped with the continent at all, whose natures were genuinely incomprehensible rather than merely alien. Those encounters gave her a perspective on the conjunction's legacy that Geralt did not have, the knowledge that it could have been worse. Much worse. Let the Bestiary dissolve now. Let the Noonwraith's pale form fade back into the shimmer of the summer field. Let the Leshen's antlered shadow recede into the forest that was always dark at that depth. Let the Drowner sink back below the surface of whatever river it has been standing in. You are not in any of those places. You are here, in the particular warmth of wherever you have settled for this night, and the dark around you is the ordinary dark of a closed room, not the uncanny dark of a continent forest that has something wrong in it. The creatures of the post-conjunction world exist in the story, and the story will be here tomorrow. They do not exist in the room around you. The air you are breathing is just air. The right temperature, the right composition, not borrowed from another sphere. Let your breathing find its slowest rhythm. Let the images settle into the deep background where stories go when sleep arrives. The history keeps, and you are almost there. The darkness behind your eyes is deeper now than it was when we began. Let it be. The voice will find you wherever you have drifted. It does not require you to be alert, only to be present in the loose, undemanding way that the spaces between waking and sleep make available. You do not need to hold the thread tightly. The thread holds itself. We have moved through the cosmic rupture of the conjunction and through the specific shape of the fear it seeded into the continent's landscape. We have stood in the summer fields and the old forests and looked at what the overlapping spheres left behind. Now we come to the human response, or rather, to the response of a particular group of humans who looked at the post-conjunction world with something rarer than courage. They looked at it with method, with the understanding that courage alone was not sufficient to the problem, and that what was needed was not merely people willing to face the monsters, but people specifically, deliberately, irreversibly transformed into something capable of doing so. The origin of The Witcher is not a heroic origin story in the sense that the popular tradition prefers. It is not the tale of a great warrior who discovered his destiny, or a chosen one marked by prophecy, or a volunteer moved by selfless love for a threatened world. It is something stranger and more honest than any of those things, the record of an experiment, of men who decided that the human body was insufficient for the task at hand and set about changing it at enormous cost and with incomplete understanding of what they were creating. The scholars who founded what would eventually become the Witcher schools were not warriors. They were mages, practitioners of the magical arts who had survived the conjunction, and who understood, better than the general population, both what had come through and why ordinary methods of dealing with it were inadequate. An ordinary soldier with an ordinary sword could kill some of the post-conjunction creatures, the weaker ghouls, the smaller drowners, the less formidable of the arachnomorphs. These yielded to sufficient force applied with sufficient courage. But the more powerful creatures, the ones that had survived in their original spheres by being genuinely dangerous to everything around them, required something that ordinary soldiers did not have. They required speed that human reflexes could not produce. They required strength that human muscle mass could not sustain. They required the ability to process combat information, the trajectory of a claw, the tell of a predator's weight shift before the lunge, faster than the human nervous system was designed to process information. They required the ability to survive exposure to substances that the monsters produced as biological weapons, venoms and poisons calibrated to their original prey, which meant the ability to metabolize those substances in ways the ordinary human liver and kidney could not manage. And they required, perhaps most importantly, the ability to use magic. The signs, that compressed system of battlefield sorcery, while doing everything else simultaneously. The mages who founded the schools understood that they could not train humans to do these things. Training operates within the boundaries of what the human body is capable of. The problem they faced required exceeding those boundaries, so they chose a different method, and the method they chose is one that the continent has never entirely decided how to feel about. Not in the centuries when the Witchers were celebrated, not in the centuries when they were feared, and not in the present moment of the saga, where they are almost gone, and the question of how to feel about what was done to make them is largely academic. They chose children, young enough that the body had not yet calcified into its adult form, still plastic enough to survive changes that would kill a formed adult, young enough that the nervous system retained the developmental flexibility required for the new pathways the mutations would need to establish. The mages took in boys, orphans most accounts suggest, or the sons of families so poor that the choice between certain poverty and uncertain survival at Kaer Morhen had a particular arithmetic to it, and they began to transform them. The word transform is too clean for what actually happened. What actually happened is better described as a sustained assault on the body's own organizing principles, in which those principles were overwritten, one at a time, with new ones. The trial of the grasses is the name the Witcher tradition gives to the central mutation process. The administration of alchemical substances derived from monster biology, plant compounds from the old elven pharmacopoeia, and materials whose origin the oldest records describe, in terms that suggest they came through the conjunction from places where the boundary between chemistry and magic is less distinct than it is in the continent's reality. The trial is called a trial because it is one in the most fundamental sense, an experience you either survive or do not, with no possibility of a partial result. The accounts that survive from those who underwent the trial of the grasses and lived to describe it do not make comfortable reading, not because the descriptions are graphic, though some are, but because they describe, with remarkable consistency across different accounts from different eras and different schools, an experience of dissolution, the sensation that the self is being taken apart at a level more fundamental than the physical, that what is being altered is not merely muscle and nerve and organ, but something underneath those things. The trial breaks the body down to something approaching its component materials and reconstructs it according to the new specifications, and the breaking is experienced before the rebuilding, fully and without anesthesia. It is worth sitting with that for a long moment, not to dwell in suffering. Sleep narration is not the place for dwelling in suffering, but to honour the specific weight of what the Witcher origin means. These were not volunteers who understood what they were consenting to. They were children who had been brought to a fortress in the mountains, and who entered a process the outcome of which was never certain. A significant proportion of those who underwent the trial of the grasses did not survive it. The exact numbers vary by account and by era, but the consistent picture that emerges from the oldest records is one in which success was not the expected outcome. Success was the hoped-for outcome, the prayed-for outcome, the outcome that the mages who administered the trial were working toward with every refinement of their technique. But the expected outcome, in the statistical sense, was death. The children who survived were transformed in ways that they spent the rest of their very long lives learning to navigate. Faster than human, stronger than human, resistant to disease and poison in ways that made ordinary illness a memory, capable of the signs, capable of consuming the potions that enhance their already enhanced abilities still further, potions that would have killed the person they used to be, and sterile. The mutations that produced the Witcher's abilities had, as a consequence that the founders apparently did not anticipate or did not consider a sufficient reason to stop, produced sterility as a universal side effect. No Witcher could father or bear children. The tradition could not reproduce itself biologically. It could only perpetuate through recruitment, through the process that had created it. The mutations did not stop at the trial of the grasses for those who survived it. The survivors underwent further processes, additional alchemical interventions aimed at enhancing specific capabilities. The most visible of these, and the one that would most mark the Witcher in the eyes of the outside world, was the alteration of the eyes. The mutation that gave Witchers their characteristic cat-like pupils, capable of dilation in darkness so complete that the Witcher can navigate by starlight alone, also gave their irises the pale, almost colourless quality that became the most immediately recognisable marker of what they were. You could recognise a Witcher across a crowded tavern room by the eyes before you saw anything else. And the world, which had spent enough time being told that the eyes were the window to the soul, read those eyes as evidence of a soul that had been substantially altered. The mutations also affected the emotional landscape in ways that the Witcher tradition has always been careful to explain, and that the popular tradition has always been careful to misrepresent. The alchemical process reduced the intensity of certain emotional responses, not eliminated them, as the folk tradition insists, but reduced them in the specific way that turning down the volume reduces a signal. The signal is still there. The music is still playing. It is simply quieter, and the quieter volume makes it possible to function in situations where the full volume of human emotional response would produce paralysis. This is the origin of the Witcher reputation for coldness, for the mutant's absence of feeling, for the monster hunter who has become monstrous through proximity to monsters. None of these characterizations are accurate, and all of them contain enough truth to be convincing to people who want to believe them. Geralt feels grief. He feels anger. He feels something that functions in all the relevant ways as love. For Yennefer, for Ciri, for the particular quality of the road in the early morning when the mist is still low and the day has not yet committed to any particular kind of weather. He simply feels these things at a volume that allows him to continue moving through the world while feeling them, which is, when you think about it, something that many people struggle toward their entire lives and never quite achieve. The final mutation process, the trial of the mountains undertaken by a subset of those who survived the grasses, pushed the transformation still further into territory where the line between human and something else becomes genuinely difficult to locate. The cat school witchers who underwent additional eye mutations, the early wolf school graduates who emerged from the mountains with hair gone white, not from age but from the final phase of the process, as if the body's pigment-producing systems had finally surrendered to everything that had been asked of them. Geralt's white hair is not vanity and not age. It is the record of the trial of the mountains, on a body that survived something that most bodies did not. It announces to anyone who knows what they are looking at the complete history of what was done to him, the grasses, the mountains, the full sequence of transformations that produced the specific and the unrepeatable thing that Geralt of Rivia is. The swords on his back, the silver one and the steel one, are the practical expression of what those transformations were for. Silver for monsters, steel for men. Two categories that the world the conjunction made requires maintaining simultaneously. Yennefer understands the witch's origin in a way that few people outside the profession do, because her own origin, the transformation that the Arethusa training performed on a hunchbacked girl from Vengerberg, has its own parallel logic. The mage's transformation is less physically radical than the witch's, but it is no less total. It too involves the overwriting of what was there before. It too involves a cost that was not fully disclosed before the process began. Yennefer's infertility, like Geralt's, was a consequence of the transformation, the price extracted by the magic for the power it delivered. The two of them carry the same kind of mark, the mark of people who were changed by processes they did not fully understand into things they did not fully choose to become. What binds them, ultimately, beyond the magic of the Jinn's wish that the folk tradition loves to point to as the explanation, is this recognition that they are both post-conjunction products, both things the world made in response to the conjunction's legacy. The mage and the witcher, different instruments for managing the same impossible situation, both transformed past the point of ordinary humanity, both carrying the specific grief of people who've been made into something that the world needs but does not love. Ciri was never subjected to the trial of the grasses. The transformation that was planned for her, the female witcher experiments that the fortress's history whispers about, never completed. She is a witcher in training but not in mutation, and the power she carries comes from a deeper source than alchemy. Let the image of the transformation settle now. Not the pain of it. Let that dissolve. But what remains after the pain, the thing that was made, the white hair, the cat's eyes, the silver sword on the back, the man on the road in all weathers, going toward the thing that everyone else is moving away from. There is something in the witch's origin that is very quiet underneath the strangeness of it. A person was made at great cost and without full consent into something necessary, and the thing that was made went out into the world and did the necessary thing for centuries, regardless of what the world thought of him for doing it. You do not need to hold the weight of that tonight. Let it rest where histories rest, in the deep background of the mind, present but not pressing. Your breathing is slow. The room around you is quiet. The road is empty tonight. and the Witcher on it is very far away in the telling, and safe enough for now. Sleep is finding you. Let it. Breathe in and out. There is a particular quality of rest available in the middle of a long story, a rest that is different from the rest at the beginning, because the world of the story has had time to accumulate around you. The continent is more real now than it was when we started. The conjunction has happened. The monsters have settled into their post-conjunction lives. And somewhere in the mountains of the north, a group of mages with a difficult problem and an incomplete solution have begun to build a fortress. The fortress is the subject of this hour, not merely as architecture, though the architecture is extraordinary, and we will spend some time in it, but as an idea, as the physical expression of everything the founders of the Witcher tradition believed about what they were doing and why it needed a home. Every building tells you something about the beliefs of the people who built it, their relationship to permanence, their sense of threat, their understanding of community and purpose, and the specific kind of safety they were trying to create. Kaer Morhen tells you all of these things about the people who raised it, and it tells you some things about them that they probably did not intend to reveal. Let your weight settle fully now. There is no urgency in this telling. The fortress has been standing, in various states of completeness and ruin, for approximately 1,000 years, and a few more minutes will not change what it has to say. Let the mountain come into your mind's eye. Let the cold of it settle around you, distinct from the cold of your room, the older cold of stone and altitude and the kind of quiet that can only be achieved very far from other people. Kaer Morhen sits in the mountains of the region that the continent calls Caedwen, in the most remote northern passes, at an altitude where summer is brief and uncertain, and winter is the dominant reality for the better part of each year. The approach to it is not designed to be easy. The path that winds up from the valley floor through the pine forests and the scree fields and the exposed ridgelines was not a road in the sense that the lowland roads are roads. It was a series of difficulties calibrated to be surmountable by people who knew what they were doing and prohibitive to people who did not. Kaer Morhen does not advertise its location. It has never wanted visitors who did not already know exactly where they were going. The name means Keep of the Old Sea in the Elder tongue, a name that has puzzled historians for centuries, given that Kaer Morhen is nowhere near the sea and is, if anything, among the most thoroughly landlocked locations on the continent. The leading interpretation is that the name refers not to a geographical sea but to a conceptual one, to the old deep magic that saturated the site before the fortress was built, the quality of otherness that the mages who chose the location apparently felt in the stone and the water and the particular resonance of the mountain air at that altitude. The old sea, the sea of time perhaps, the undifferentiated depth of what existed before the conjunction made everything specific and dangerous. The construction took decades. The fortress was not conceived as a single building, but as a compound, a system of structures organized around the central keep that would eventually contain all the functions the Witcher school required. The training hall with its obstacle courses and sparring grounds, the alchemy laboratory where the mutagens and the potions were formulated and tested and refined across generations of increasingly precise technique. The library, which over the centuries accumulated the most comprehensive bestiary on the continent, not a library of literature or philosophy or law, but a working archive of practical lethality organized by creature type, continuously updated with field reports from witchers who had encountered something new and survived the encounter. The architecture of Kaer Morhen is not beautiful in the way that the great southern castles are beautiful. The carved facades of Cintra, the soaring towers of Vizima's palace district. It is functional in a way that becomes beautiful only if you understand what the function is. The walls are thick enough to matter against siege weapons, though no army ever besieged it in its operational years. The windows are narrow and set high, giving light without vulnerability. The Great Hall's fireplace is large enough to heat the stone floor several feet in every direction, because the founders understood that the mountain cold is not seasonal. It lives in the stone year-round, and the stone will take all the heat you give it and ask for more. There is something worth pausing on in the choice to build Kaer Morhen where it was built. The founders did not build a Witcher school in the lowlands, near the populations the Witchers were meant to serve. They did not build it in a central location that would make communication and recruitment straightforward. They built it in a place that was, by design, difficult to reach, invisible to casual observation, and positioned at the intersection of 3 different kingdoms' borders, which meant, in the political logic of the continent, that it fell under the clear sovereignty of none of them. This was a choice made with awareness. The mages who founded Kaer Morhen had worked with kingdoms and for kingdoms, and they understood, with a particular clarity of people who have watched political institutions from the inside, that kingdoms are unreliable patrons for projects that operate according to their own logic. A Witcher school embedded in a kingdom would be subject to that kingdom's political needs. Its graduates would be directed according to the king's priorities, not the continent's. Its curriculum might be shaped by royal preference. Its autonomy, the thing that made it useful, the thing that allowed it to make decisions about what was necessary rather than what was politically convenient, would be subject to the endless pressures that political proximity generates. The remoteness of Kaer Morhen was not a concession to logistical difficulty. It was the design. The distance was the point. A school that the kingdoms could not easily reach was a school that the kingdoms couldn't easily control, and the founders, for all their limitations, for all the things they did not anticipate and the costs they did not fully account for, understood that what they were creating needed to be free of the control of the people who would most benefit from controlling it. It is worth sitting with this choice for a moment in the specific context of what the Witchers eventually became in the world's imagination. A school built in isolation, training young men through processes that outsiders could not observe, producing graduates whose abilities were radically unlike anything the surrounding population could achieve. This is not, in the folk tradition's vocabulary, a school. In the folk tradition's vocabulary, this is a cult. This is a place where strange things happen to people who go in and do not come out the same. The deliberate inaccessibility of Kaer Morhen, which was a rational response to the political realities of the continent, was read by the world outside it as evidence of something to hide. The walls that kept the politics out also kept the scrutiny out, and in the absence of scrutiny, imagination filled the gap, and imagination is not kind to things it cannot see. The pendulum, the great training obstacle at Kaer Morhen, the swinging log apparatus that every Witcher apprentice spent their first months learning to dodge with increasing precision, is the detail from the fortress's life that appears most often in the accounts. Not the alchemy, not the bestiary, the pendulum. A large log suspended on chains, set to swinging by the instructor, the apprentice required to navigate through or around it without being struck. The consequence of failure being the kind of bruising that the mutations were already rendering less damaging than it had been before the trial. The pendulum was not a sophisticated piece of training equipment. It was a piece of wood on chains. But the hours spent with it, the 10,000 repetitions of read the arc, feel the timing, move before the wood arrives, produced the specific quality of physical intelligence that the Witcher profession required in the field. The training yard in summer was a particular place. The mountain sun arrives late and at an angle, clearing the eastern ridge only mid-morning, and the shadow of the keep walls stays on part of the yard until almost noon. The stone of the yard floor has absorbed decades of sweat and weapon oil, and the particular residue left by the obstacle courses in wet weather. It smells of effort, of the specific combination of exertion and mountain air that is the smell of Kaer Morhen in the accounts of those who knew it in its operational years, an institutional smell, the way schools and barracks all develop institutional smells that are the accumulated olfactory record of everyone who's been in them and everything they did there. The library was kept by a succession of scholars, some human, some with older heritage, who understood that the Witcher Bestiary was a living document rather than a historical one. New creatures appeared with each generation, new variants of existing creatures as the post-conjunction species adapted to the continent over time, new behaviours observed in creatures that the previous entries had described as predictable. The entry on the Leshen alone was revised 11 times over the school's operational centuries, each revision adding layers of nuance to the understanding of how a Leshen reorganises the ecology around it, how to identify the signs of a nascent Leshen before it has fully claimed its territory, how to perform the specific ritual sequence that breaks a Leshen's hold on a forest without simply killing the creature and leaving the forest disoriented by the absence of the presence it has been growing around. In the evenings, in the operational years, the great hall was where the brothers gathered, the long tables, the fire large enough to warm the stone, the particular atmosphere of people who live together in isolation and have developed, through the shared experience of the training and the shared strangeness of what the training made them, a community that is not available to them anywhere else on the continent. When Geralt returns to Kaer Morhen in the later years of the saga, returns to the ruined version, the version with the keep walls partially collapsed and the library looted, and the training yard growing over with the mountain grass that fills in wherever the stone has been neglected, the return has a quality that the narrative does not need to explain, because the quality is present in the architecture itself. This is what was. These walls held something. The moss growing in the cracks of the training yard floor is growing in the residue of everything that happened here, and the residue is still present in the stone even if the people who left it are mostly gone. Ciri's training at Kaer Morhen, the month she spent learning what the school's final generation of teachers could still offer, took place in the ruins of an institution rather than in its fullness. She learned the pendulum with a pendulum that had been repaired several times with wood that was not the original wood. She learned the signs in a training hall where the walls needed pointing and the fire smoked because the chimney had been imperfectly maintained. She learned from Vesemir, who'd been teaching witchers for longer than most kingdoms had been ruled by their current dynasties, and from Geralt and Lambert and Eskel and Cohen, who were the last students the school had fully made. What she received at Kaer Morhen was therefore not Kaer Morhen in its fullness, but Kaer Morhen as a transmission, the knowledge preserved and passed on by the people who had received it, separated from the institution that had originally generated it. This is how traditions survive their own physical ends, not in the buildings, which can be burned, but in the people who carry what the buildings taught, who pass it to the next person, who passes it to the next. Kaer Morhen was most itself, perhaps, not in its operational centuries, but in the winter, when the last of its graduates taught the girl who would carry the Elder Blood, and the training happened not because the institution required it, but because the people in the ruins chose to continue. If sleep is gathering around you now, let it take you. Subscribe before you drift. The next chapter of this history is waiting when you return. Rest well. Let Kaer Morhen settle into you now, not the ruin, the fortress, the training yard in the morning shadow of the Eastern Keep, the library with its continuously revised bestiary, the great hall fire, the community of people who were strange in the same specific way, gathered in the one place in the world where that strangeness was the norm rather than the exception. You are resting. The mountain cold is not your cold tonight. The stone floors and the narrow windows and the altitude that makes the stars look close enough to touch, these are in the telling, not in the room with you. The fortress stood for 1,000 years in various forms. It is standing still, in its ruined way, in the story. Stone does not forget what it was built for. Let your breathing find the slow rhythm of the mountain night, long in, long out. The fire in the great hall burns low. The training yard is quiet. The history will be here tomorrow. Kaer Morhen will be here tomorrow. And so, gently and without urgency will you. Sleep now. The keep endures. You have come some distance now. The history has been settling into you in layers. The conjunction at the foundation, the monsters above it, the transformation of the witches above that, the fortress where the transformation happened above that, each layer resting on the one beneath it, the way geological strata rest, each one telling you something about the time it was deposited. Let the layers rest. You do not need to hold them consciously. They are already there. What comes next is the layer that most defines the Witcher in the world's imagination. Not the mutations, not the silver sword, not even Kaer Morhen itself. It is the contract. The piece of parchment or the verbal agreement or the handshake across a tavern table that represents the entirety of the Witcher's relationship to the world he serves. You have a problem. I will solve your problem. You will pay me for solving it. We will go our separate ways, and neither of us will pretend this was anything other than a transaction. The contract is simple. The ethics built around it are not, and the body of principles that the Witcher schools developed over their operational centuries to govern how Witchers engage with the world. The code, as it is known in the tradition, never entirely written down, never entirely consistent between one school and the next, but recognizable in its essential commitments across all of them, is one of the most quietly radical ethical systems that the continent ever produced, which is part of why the continent was never entirely comfortable with it. The contract system was not invented by the Witcher schools. It emerged from them over the first generations of operational practice, as the early Witchers encountered a world that had not yet developed a reliable way to deploy them. The first Witchers went out into the continent without a framework. They encountered populations that needed them and did not know how to ask. They encountered lords who wanted to use them and did not know how to pay. They encountered, in the absence of any established protocol, every variety of human behavior that the absence of protocol produces, the gratitude that curdled into suspicion, the payment that was withheld on spurious grounds, the request for services that went well beyond what any reasonable being could be expected to provide. The contract, as it eventually crystallized, was a response to all of this. It was a mechanism for converting what could otherwise be an open-ended obligation into a specific and bounded one. The problem was named, the price was agreed, the work was done, the payment was received, the Witcher moved on. No ongoing relationship, no claim on future service, no expectation of gratitude that could sour into resentment. The contract converted the Witcher from a wandering supernatural problem solver with unclear obligations into something the continent's commercial and legal traditions could recognize, a professional delivering a service at an agreed price. The price itself was a point of perpetual contention. Witchers charged more than ordinary mercenaries, and they needed to. The potions and the equipment and the maintenance of the skills required constant investment, and the contracts were not constant. There were stretches of road where nothing came up for weeks, seasons when the creature activity in a given region was low, and the contracts were few. The fees the witchers charged had to account for the lean times as well as the active ones, the way any professional's rates must account for the overhead of being available, rather than merely being employed. The world, which needed the witchers when the contracts arose and did not think about them in the intervals, resented the fees as a matter of almost universal consistency. The fee was always too high. The man whose child was alive because of the contract always thought the price was reasonable. The alderman who had paid it and whose child was alive and who was going about the comfortable business of ordinary life 2 months later remembered only that he had paid a great deal of money to a strange man with odd eyes who had not seemed particularly grateful for the opportunity. This is the arithmetic of the contract system's cultural failure, and it was baked in from the beginning. The witcher is necessary at the moment of the problem. The payment is made at the moment of the problem when necessity concentrates the mind, and then the problem is solved, and necessity releases the mind, and what is left is the memory of the payment without the visceral memory of what necessitated it. The code that governed the witcher's conduct in the world was built around a central commitment that the world found deeply uncomfortable: neutrality. The witcher does not take sides in political conflicts. The witcher does not serve kings or serve against kings. The witcher does not participate in wars between human factions, does not assassinate political enemies, does not make himself a weapon in the ongoing competition between the continent states and factions for power and territory. The witcher kills monsters. The definition of monster in the code's usage does not include human beings acting according to human political logic, however monstrous that logic might be. This is worth pausing on, because it is the most radical and the most routinely misunderstood element of the witcher's ethical position. The neutrality is not moral cowardice. It is not indifference to human suffering. It is the considered judgment that a witcher who takes sides in political conflicts becomes a weapon in those conflicts, and a weapon in those conflicts serves the purposes of whoever is wielding it, rather than the purposes of the populations who need the monster problem managed. The witcher who joins one king's war against another king provides genuine value to that king, and no value whatsoever to the village whose drowner problem is still there when the war ends. The code's neutrality is a commitment to the original function, the management of the post-conjunction inheritance, against the perpetual pressure from every political actor on the continent to convert the witcher's unusual abilities into a resource for the usual human activities of war and conquest. Geralt's relationship to the neutrality is complicated, famously, explicitly, and self-consciously complicated. He believes in the principle, he returns to it, in his thinking and in his arguments with Yennefer and Dandelion, and the various kings and sorceresses and political actors who try to recruit him to their causes, as the organizing principle that makes the witcher's existence something other than a very expensive mercenary. And yet he violates it. He intervenes. He makes choices in situations where the code would direct him to walk away, and the choices he makes are recognizably moral choices. They emerge from a genuine ethical engagement with what he is looking at, not from the calculation of a man who has decided neutrality is inconvenient in this particular case. The contradiction is not hypocrisy. It is the thing that makes Geralt interesting as a figure, the witcher who has internalized the code's purpose deeply enough to know when following the code's letter would betray its purpose. when the lesser evil is not lesser enough, when walking away is not neutral but complicit. The code was built for monsters. The world keeps producing situations that the code was not built for. The silver sword and the steel sword, carried simultaneously on the witcher's back, are the most visible expression of the code's practical philosophy. Steel for men, for human threats, the bandits and the soldiers, and the occasional political violence that the road inevitably produces. Silver for monsters, for the post-conjunction creatures whose biology is disrupted by silver in ways that ordinary steel does not disrupt it. The two swords together announce what the Witcher is, a person who lives in a world that contains both kinds of threat and has decided to be prepared for both without collapsing the distinction between them. The signs, the 5 basic magical gestures that the Witcher's training produces, are built around the same philosophy of preparation without escalation. Ard, the telekinetic push; Igni, the fire; Erden, the trap; Axi, the compulsion; Quen, the shield. Each of them developed in response to specific field problems that the early witchers encountered. Ard for breaking the physical momentum of a charging creature; Igni for the creatures whose biology makes them vulnerable to sustained heat; Earden for the spectres and wraiths whose phase of existence makes physical weapons difficult to apply; Axi for the rare and delicate situation in which ending a creature's behaviour through compulsion is preferable to ending the creature; Quen for the moments when preparation has failed and the only available response is to survive until a better response becomes possible. The Witcher's alchemy, the potions brewed from monster components and plant matter and materials from the older elven pharmacopoeia, occupies its own branch of the code's practical philosophy. The potions are necessary because the mutations are not sufficient. The enhanced strength and speed and reflexes of the mutated Witcher body are formidable, but some of what the continent contains requires a further enhancement, a temporary pushing of the already pushed body further than its resting state will take it. Cat for darkness navigation; Thunderbolt for the acceleration of reflexes in combat with fast-moving opponents; Swallow for the acceleration of healing in the aftermath of wounds; White Raffard's decoction for the emergency conversion of the last available resources into the capacity to survive the next 60 seconds. These potions are toxic to ordinary humans. They're brewed from components that would kill an unmodified person before they had the opportunity to provide any benefit. The Witcher's body, transformed by the trial of the grasses, can process them, can take the toxicity and convert it into function, metabolizing what would otherwise be poison into something that briefly makes the already extraordinary more so. The brewing and consumption of these compounds is another thing the world watched the Witchers do and did not understand, and therefore feared, and fear, in the folk tradition of the continent, has a very short distance to travel before it arrives at hatred. Geralt's neutrality, and his departures from it, trace the philosophical spine of the entire saga, the decisions that define his character, taking the law of surprise, accepting Ciri as his destiny, choosing to stand in specific places at specific moments, despite the code's direction to keep moving, are all decisions made at the point where the code's letter and the code's purpose diverge. He has thought about these things more carefully than anyone who has called him a mutant or a freak or a monster lover has thought about them. He has arrived at positions through genuine moral reasoning that the world around him has arrived at, if it has arrived at them at all, through the much shorter path of instinct and tradition. Yennefer's relationship to her own professional code, the Brotherhood of Sorcerers' rules about neutrality, about the obligations of the mage in the political landscape of the continent, parallels Geralt's relationship to the Witcher Code in ways that are not accidental. Both codes were built to protect a profession that works in proximity to power without being of power. Both codes have the same structural vulnerability. The person who has internalized the purpose deeply enough to know when following the letter betrays the purpose. Yennefer, like Geralt, has that internalization, and Yennefer, like Geralt, has a list of departures from her code that is long and specific and entirely defensible if you are willing to do the philosophical work of defending it. The contract Geralt took for Ciri, the law of surprise that bound their destinies before either of them understood what the binding meant, was not, strictly speaking, a Witcher contract. It was something older, a piece of the continent's folk magic, the kind of obligation that predates the Witcher schools and will outlast them. But Geralt approached it the way he approaches every contract, with the understanding that what you have agreed to you must see through, and what you must see through will cost something, and the cost is the point. The cost is the thing that makes it mean what it means. The code and the contract are the Witcher's way of being in the world. They are not perfect. Nothing built by people navigating an imperfect world will be. But they are honest. In a world where honesty is not the common currency, let the code settle into you now, like something quietly decided. The neutrality, the contract, the silver sword and the steel sword and the knowledge of which one is for what. There is something restful in the clarity of it, underneath the difficulty. Here is the problem. Here is what I will do about it. Here is the price. Here are the terms. No ongoing obligation. No pretense of relationship beyond the transaction. A professional truth told to a world that mostly prefers comfortable fictions. You do not need to hold any of this consciously. Let it drift into the background where all the night's history has been gathering, layer on layer deeper than thought. Your breathing is very slow now. The room is quiet. The contract tonight is simple. The story offers rest, and rest is what you accept in return. The code allows for that. The code has always allowed for that. Sleep now. The transaction is complete. Let your breathing find its slowest rhythm now. The kind that happens without effort. The in-breath arriving before you have asked for it. The out-breath releasing before you have decided to release. You're deeper into the night than you were when we began, and the history has been accumulating in you in the way that all things accumulate in the quiet hours, without announcement, without effort, simply present in a way that was not possible when the day was still making its demands. We have spent several hours together in the company of the Witchers at their most essential, the conjunction that made them necessary, the monsters that made them urgent, the transformation that made them possible, the fortress that gave the transformation a home, the code that gave the transformed beings a way of being in a world that did not know what to make of them. We have treated the Witchers, in other words, as the history of a profession, as a response to a problem, shaped by the requirements of that response into something specific and extraordinary. Now we come to the part of the history that is harder to carry, not because it involves greater violence than the trial of the grasses, or greater loss than the conjunction, but because it involves the specific and recognizable cruelty of fear turned into policy. The history of how the continent came to hate the people it had built to protect it. The roots of that hatred, how they grew and where they reached and what they eventually produced. The fear did not begin with hatred. This is the first thing to understand, and it is a thing the folk tradition of the continent obscures, because folk traditions are better at preserving the emotional state of an era than the process that produced it. The continent did not greet the first witches with hostility. It greeted them with the complicated mixture of relief and unease that most communities feel in the presence of something powerful they do not fully understand, but that is, at this particular moment, solving a very real problem. In the first generations of the Witcher schools, the contracts were plentiful, and the gratitude was genuine if uneasy. The creature activity in the decades immediately following the full establishment of the schools was high. The post-conjunction ecology was still finding its equilibrium. New nesting grounds were being established by creatures that had been in the world for long enough to start breeding in it, and the human populations expanding into formerly uninhabited territories were encountering things that the territories had been uninhabited because of. The witches arrived at exactly the right moment, professionally speaking. The problem they were built to solve was at its most acute precisely when the solution became available. The unease ran alongside the gratitude from the beginning. This is the nature of necessary things that are also strange things. You cannot simply be grateful for them without also being slightly frightened of them, and the slight fright has a quality of persistence that the gratitude does not. Gratitude is situational. It peaks at the moment of need and begins declining as soon as the need is addressed. Fear is structural. Once it has attached itself to something, it does not require refreshing. It simply continues, updated periodically with new observations that confirm what the fear already knew. The early observations were not reassuring, from the perspective of a community that needed to understand the Witcher as a simple kind of good. The mutations were visible and strange. The eyes were immediately alarming in the way that things which are almost human but not quite human are always alarming. The wrongness is more disturbing than outright difference would be, because the brain looks for the human and finds something that almost passes, and then, at the last instant, does not. The stillness, the speed, the capacity to consume, calmly and without visible effect, substances that the witnesses knew from their own experience with basic chemistry were toxic enough to kill a horse. These were not the attributes of an ally in the folk tradition's vocabulary. These were the attributes of a monster. The mages who had created the witches had not apparently given sufficient thought to the question of what the world would eventually decide about what they had made. They'd been focused on the problem, the monsters, the contracts, the deployment of the solution, and the optics of the solution were not their primary concern. The witches were sent into the world without a coherent narrative about what they were and what they were not. That narrative gap was filled, as narrative gaps always are, by the available imagination of the people who encountered them and the available interests of the people who had reasons to want the imagination to run in specific directions. It is worth pausing here and sitting with the specific mechanism of how fear becomes hatred in a community, because it is a process that the continent's history illustrates with uncomfortable clarity, and that has applications well beyond the world of the saga. Fear is not inherently aggressive. In its early stages, fear of the other, the strange person, the strange practice, the strange community that operates according to rules you do not recognize, expresses itself primarily as avoidance. You cross the street. You do not drink at the same well. You seat the Witcher at the corner table, away from the other patrons, and you are grateful he is here, and grateful he will leave. This is the phase the continent was in for the first several generations of the Witcher school's operation. The transition from fear to hatred requires a catalyst, something that converts the passive avoidance of the strange into active hostility toward it. On the continent, that catalyst was the Church of the Eternal Fire and the mage politician class that found, over the school's 2nd and 3rd centuries of operation, that the witcher's strangeness was a political resource. A population that fears something can be organized around that fear. An institution that names and validates and provides moral scaffolding for the fear. That tells the frightened people that their fear is correct. That the strange thing is not merely strange but dangerous. Not merely dangerous but corrupted. Not merely corrupted but an agent of the wrong kind of power. That institution becomes essential to the communities it serves, because it has made itself the manager of an anxiety those communities already had. The accusations that began circulating about the Witcher schools in their middle centuries had a structure that is recognizable from countless other historical contexts in any world that has ever had an outgroup to fear. They practiced dark magic, which was true in the sense that the mutations used alchemical processes that the mainstream magical tradition did not sanction, and false in the sense that the implication of malicious purpose was invented. They had no souls, which was a theological rather than a factual claim, unverifiable by definition, but enormously powerful in a cultural context where the Church of the Eternal Fire controlled the cultural definition of what having a soul meant. They were immune to emotion. The mutation reduced emotional intensity reframed not as a professional adaptation, but as evidence of a fundamental inhumanity. They corrupted the children they recruited, a claim whose emotional power derived entirely from its placement of the recruitment in a moral frame that the recruitment itself, viewed without the frame, did not occupy. These accusations did not need to be true to be effective. They needed to be plausible. And in a world where the Witcher schools operated in deliberate isolation, where the processes of the transformation were not publicly observable, where the results of the transformation were visibly and strikingly unusual, plausibility was readily available to anyone who wanted to supply it. The specific texture of the hatred as it settled into the continent's culture is worth examining in its particulars, because the particulars reveal the architecture of the prejudice more clearly than any general account can. The epithet freaks of nature became the most common shorthand. It is worth unpacking that phrase rather than skimming past it, because it contains, in compressed form, the entire philosophical objection that the continent's mainstream culture had to the Witcher's existence. Freak, a deviation from the normal carrying the implication that normal is a moral category rather than a statistical one. That deviation from it is not merely unusual but wrong. Of nature, locating the wrongness in the domain of the natural order, implying that what has been done to produce the Witcher is a violation of how things are supposed to be. The phrase freaks of nature does not merely describe, it condemns. It places the Witcher outside the category of things that deserve the consideration extended to things that belong to the natural order. Children were taught to fear witches before they had personal experience of them. This is the mechanism through which prejudice perpetuates itself across generations, not through the renewal of the original experience that generated the fear, but through the transmission of the fear itself, packaged as wisdom, as precaution, as the kind of knowledge that good parents pass to children before the world provides the opportunity for children to develop their own observations. A child who has been taught to fear the witch's eyes will fear them before she has looked into them. A child who has been told that witches feel nothing will interpret the witch's professional composure as evidence of the inhumanity rather than evidence of the training, because the interpretation has been preloaded. The innkeepers who seated witches at corner tables, the merchants who quoted higher prices and lower quality to the mutant on principle, the village mothers who pulled their children to the other side of the road when the white-haired man came through, These were not, for the most part, people who had made a considered personal decision about witches based on experience. They were people who had inherited an emotional orientation from the culture around them, and were acting it out in the small daily ways that inherited emotional orientations get acted out. The hatred was ambient. It did not require personal conviction. It required only the path of least resistance, which in this case ran directly through the witcher's experience of every village he had ever entered. The loneliness this produced is not a minor detail of the witcher's biography. It is the defining condition of the witcher's life on the road. The contract requires entry into the community. The community's ambient hostility makes the entry uncomfortable and the departure a relief. The witcher needs the contracts because the contracts are the profession. The contracts require the communities. The communities provide the contract and the hostility simultaneously, and the witcher navigates the combination with the professional composure that the communities read as evidence of inhuman coldness. Geralt's silences in taverns are not the silences of a man who has nothing to say. They are the silences of a man who has learned, through several decades of attempting to say things and watching the attempt be received as threatening or bizarre or simply wrong. That silence is the more efficient option. The economy of Geralt's speech, the single words where other people use sentences, the lifted eyebrow where other people use paragraphs, is the linguistic residue of a lifetime of being the corner table person, of being the one who is served last and watched most carefully, and asked to leave before the evening has fully ended. What Dandelion, the bard, the unwanted companion, the man who chose to walk alongside the Witcher for reasons that the Witcher spent many years finding genuinely inexplicable, what Dandelion understood about Geralt that most of the continent did not, was that the silence was not absence. It was presence, carefully managed. Geralt's attention, in the moments between the contract and the road, is total. He notices everything the people around him do not notice, because they are filling the space with noise. He processes the room, the exits, the people, the potential threats, not from paranoia but from the professional habit of a man who has spent his life in environments where his strangeness made him a target, and his preparation was the only reliable defense against the consequences of that targeting. Ciri's first encounter with the ambient hatred of the continent, the way the world read her as strange, as wrong, as something to be feared or used rather than understood, gave her an access to Geralt's experience that no amount of description could have produced. She encountered the world as a person who was marked by her power in a way that the world could not categorize, and therefore feared. She felt what it was to walk into a room and have the room orient around her presence as a problem to be managed. She did not develop Geralt's practiced indifference to it. She developed instead a righteous fury at it, which is perhaps the more honest response, and which the Witcher's emotional volume control had long since made unavailable to him. The roots of the hatred run through the present of the saga, like the roots of an old tree through old ground, invisible from the surface but structuring everything above them. Let the weight of the hatred settle now, and then let it go. It does not need to be carried into sleep. It is old, centuries old, and the people who generated it and the people who absorbed it are gone, and what remains is the story, which is not the same as the wound. The Witchers navigated the hatred. They continued through it, on the road in all weathers, going toward the thing the frightened village needed them to go toward, regardless of what the frightened village thought of them for going. There is something in that persistence that is worth holding very gently, just at the edge of sleep, not as a lesson, but as a quality. a particular kind of dignity in going forward when the world has decided you are something to avoid. You are warm, you are resting. Whatever the day brought, whatever weight it carried, you have set it down for tonight. The history is old enough to be someone else's story now. Let it be that. Let your breathing slow one more degree. The road is empty tonight. The Witcher is far away in the telling. Sleep now. The roots hold, and the night is quiet. You've come a long way through this history tonight. The layers have been settling into you, slowly, without insistence, the way all the things that matter settle into us during the quiet hours, when the mind has released its grip on the day's agenda and become available to older things. You do not need to be alert for what comes next. You need only to be present in the loose, undemanding way that the space between waking and sleep makes possible. What comes next is the darkest chapter in the history of the Witcher schools. Not the darkest in terms of the scale of violence. The continent has produced battles and purges that killed in numbers that dwarf anything that happened at Kaer Morhen. But the darkest in terms of what it reveals about the process we've been tracing tonight. The process by which fear becomes policy, by which ambient cultural hostility accumulates to a sufficient charge that it discharges into organised action. The pogrom at Kaer Morhen is that discharge. It is the moment when everything that had been growing in the continent's imagination about the Witcher schools was converted from prejudice into event. We will move through it carefully, not quickly. The history is not improved by being rushed, and not with the kind of dramatic emphasis that would make it feel like an entertainment rather than a reckoning. What happened at Kaer Morhen deserves to be heard at the pace of grief, which is always slower than the pace of violence. The exact date and the precise sequence of events at the pogrom are recorded differently in different sources, and the differences are not incidental. They reflect the fact that this is history written by survivors and by the people who had reasons to want the surviving account to look a certain way. The Witcher tradition's own accounts, preserved in the reduced library that remained after the looting, maintained by Vesemir and the handful of masters who endured, and the accounts of the forces that organised and carried out the attack, describe the same event in terms so different that a reader encountering them separately might not recognise the connection. What is agreed upon is the broad shape of it. In the era of the Witcher school's late maturity, several centuries after the founding, well into the period when the fear had settled from ambient unease into structured doctrine, a coalition of forces assembled in the Kaedweni passes and marched on the fortress. The coalition was organised under religious banners primarily, with the institutional backing of the Church of the Eternal Fire and the political support of the Kaedweni crown, which had its own reasons for wanting the autonomous enclave in its mountains to be removed from the equation of Kaedweni sovereignty. The religious motivation and the political motivation reinforced each other in the way that they always do when they are pursuing the same target from different directions. The journey to Kaer Morhen in winter is not a casual undertaking. The passes are difficult even in summer. In winter, with snow on the ridgelines and the temperature in the passes dropping below what ordinary military formations were equipped to sustain for extended periods, the march to the fortress required the kind of conviction that mere resentment does not produce. The force that made the march to Kaer Morhen in the killing season had been told something about what they would find there that was worth the cost of the march. They had been told in the language of the Church's most effective rhetoric that what was in that fortress was not merely strange and not merely threatening, but actively evil, a source of corruption that would continue to contaminate the world as long as it was permitted to exist. The language of contamination is worth noting carefully. It is the language that precedes the worst of what human communities do to their outgroups, the conversion of the outgroup from a different kind of people into a category of wrongness whose continued existence is framed as a danger to the existence of everything else. Once the framing is established, the violence that follows is not merely permitted, it is, within the logic of the frame, necessary. You do not negotiate with contamination, you remove it. The witches at Kaer Morhen were not unaware that something was coming. The ravens had been carrying news of the coalition's formation for weeks before it marched, but the specific combination of factors that made Kaer Morhen difficult to approach in winter also made rapid evacuation difficult, and the witches' tradition of not taking sides in political conflicts, the code's neutrality, which had always been partly a strategy for survival in a politically hostile world, had atrophied the fortress's capacity for organised military defence. Kaer Morhen had been built to be difficult to reach, not to withstand sustained assault by a force that had decided the difficulty was worth the effort. It is worth pausing here and sitting with the specific weight of what the pogrom represents in the larger history we have been tracing. Because the pogrom is not simply a tragedy with a clear victim and a clear perpetrator, however clearly it distributes the moral responsibility, it is the culmination of a process, the process we traced in the last segment, in which the continent's culture built the infrastructure of hatred over several generations, and then arrived, predictably, at the moment when the infrastructure was deployed. The people who marched on Kaer Morhen were not, for the most part, people who had personal grievances against specific witches. They were people who'd been given a story about the witches, the freaks of nature narrative, the dark magic narrative, the corrupted children narrative, and who had accepted the story with the completeness that people accept stories that validate fears they already carry. They had been told that what was in the fortress was monstrous. They had come to remove the monstrousness. From inside the logic of what they had been told, the march was not an atrocity. It was a service. This is the thing that makes the pogrom so difficult to carry without either collapsing into despair or hardening into a simple narrative of good and evil. The violence was not random. It was organised, and it was organised around a coherent if monstrous worldview, and that worldview had been constructed over generations by institutions, the church, the political class, the folk tradition, that were embedded in the continent's culture so deeply that the people who transmitted the worldview were not aware they were constructing anything. They were simply repeating what they knew, what their parents had known, what the institutions they trusted had confirmed. The masters and brothers who died at Kaer Morhen died in part because of decisions made by people who had been dead for generations. The process that killed them had begun before most of them were born, in the slow accumulation of fear into doctrine that we traced in the last segment. They were the discharge point of a charge that had been building for centuries, and the survivors, Vesemir and the few who endured, were left to navigate a world in which the charge had not discharged. It had merely spent one of its accumulated energies, and the underlying fear and hostility and institutional hatred that had organised the pogrom were still present in the culture, waiting for the next occasion. The looting of the library is the detail of the pogrom that carries the most specific weight, for me. The physical violence was one kind of destruction, the looting of the accumulated bestiary, the generations of field reports and mutation records and alchemical formulae that represented the school's operational knowledge, was a different kind. It was the attempt to ensure that what had happened at Kaer Morhen could not simply be rebuilt, that the knowledge could not outlast the institution, because the knowledge itself was what made the institution possible. What the looting produced was not the erasure of the knowledge but its dispersal, Some of what was in the library survived in the hands of the surviving masters. Some of it had already been copied and carried by witches in the field. The working notes of practitioners who could not always rely on making it back to the fortress to consult the central archive. And some of it survived in the most unexpected vessel, in the memory of Vesemir, who had been at Kaer Morhen long enough and had read widely enough that the destruction of the physical texts did not take with it everything the texts had contained. Vesemir is the figure at the centre of Kaer Morhen's aftermath, and his specific quality in that aftermath is worth dwelling on. He was already old when the pogrom happened, old in the way of witches, who age very slowly after the mutations, so that old in Vesemir's case meant decades of service, compressed into a body that showed its years as a distinguished weathering rather than a deterioration. He had trained multiple generations of witches. He had watched the school's population dwindle over the preceding decades as the contracts became less plentiful, and the recruitment became less consistent, and the political environment became less hospitable. He had known, in the way that people who have been paying attention for long enough always know, that the thing that happened was not entirely a surprise. After the pogrom, Vesemir stayed. This is the fact about him that requires the most careful consideration. The fortress was ruined and looted, and no longer safe in the ways it had been built to be safe. The survivors could have dispersed, could have gone their separate ways on the road, maintaining the Witcher profession as an individual practice rather than an institutional one. Some did. But Vesemir stayed at Kaer Morhen, in the ruins of what the school had been, and began the long process of maintaining what remained. What remained was enough to continue. Barely, some winters. The great hall still stood, or most of it. The training yard was damaged but functional. The potions that could be brewed from the surviving materials, according to the formulae that Vesemir carried in his memory, were the potions. Not the full range of what the library had once described, the subset that his memory and his surviving notes could reconstruct. He made do with the subset because the subset was what he had, and what he had was what he chose to give to the generation that came after the destruction. The training he provided to the Wolf School survivors, Lambert, Eskel, Cohen, and Geralt, was therefore Kaer Morhen's knowledge filtered through Kaer Morhen's catastrophe, delivered in Kaer Morhen's ruins by the man who had survived both the knowledge and the catastrophe. It was not the school at its fullness, but it was the school's transmission, which is the more durable form. Geralt's relationship to the pogrom is the relationship of a person to a trauma that happened before his personal memory begins. He knows what occurred at Kaer Morhen not from experience but from the testimony of the only master who survived to give testimony, Vesemir, who did not discuss it freely, and who had the particular reserve of people who have witnessed things they have decided are not improved by extensive narration. What Geralt carries from this knowledge is not grief in the acute sense. It is something more structural. The background awareness that the profession he practices, the code he adheres to, the fortress he returns to each winter, all of these exist in a form shaped by destruction. That what Kaer Morhen is in his experience is not what Kaer Morhen was in its fullness. That the school that made him is the school after the pogrom, not before it. The school as transmission rather than institution, as practice rather than community, as what survived rather than what was intended. When Ciri arrived at Kaer Morhen, the fortress she found was the ruined version that the pogrom and subsequent centuries of diminished maintenance had produced. The walls with their gaps, the library with its absences, the training yard that Vesemir maintained with a care that was partly practical, and partly something that deserves a word that is not quite reverence, but is not far from it. She was trained in the tradition's residue. She received what the Pogrom had left the tradition with. Diminished in scope, undiminished in the specifics that the surviving master had preserved, because he had decided they were worth preserving. The night that Ciri spent in Kaer Morhen with Geralt and Vesemir and the other surviving witches, the winter evenings in the great hall with the fire large enough to push the cold back from the stone floor, was something the Pogrom's organisers had tried to make impossible. The community of the school, however reduced, however late, the transmission continuing in the ruins of the institution that had been built to transmit it. The hatred had not finished what it started. The thing it had tried to end was still being passed from hand to hand in the cold of the mountain winter. If rest is finding you now, let it come. Subscribe before you drift, so the next chapter of this history is waiting when you return. The fortress endures, so do you. Let Kaer Morhen settle around you now. Not the violence of the pogrom, but what followed it. The ruins with the fire still burning in the great hall, Vesemir in the library with the books that had been looted, and the memory of the books that had been looted, making what was possible from what remained. There is something in that image that is older than comfort and quieter than hope. The persistence of people who have been tried and have not completely broken. The maintenance of what can be maintained when what was built is gone. You are warm. You are resting. The mountain cold is not your cold tonight, and the ruins of the fortress are in the telling, not in the room where you are lying. The history has been heavy tonight, in places. That is because the history is honest, and honest histories carry weight. But you do not need to carry it through the night. Set it down here, where the segment ends and the quiet begins. The fire in the great hall burns low. The training yard is still. The ruins of Kaer Morhen are quiet under the mountain stars. Sleep now. The fortress keeps its watch. There is a particular quality to this hour of the night, the one where the body has long since released its claim on alertness, where the thoughts that arrive are slower and stranger than waking thoughts, moving with the particular unhurried drift of things that have been freed from the obligation of purpose. Let that quality be what it is. Do not try to anchor it to anything specific. The voice will keep finding you. The history will keep offering itself, and you will receive as much of it as you receive, which is always exactly the right amount. After the pogrom, the long middle of the Witcher decline, a period that stretches across several centuries and that has, as long periods of gradual diminishment tend to have, the quality of weather rather than event. Not a single storm, but a slow lowering of the sky. Not a battle, but a tide going out. The creature population of the continent did not stabilize after the pogrom. It continued to change, to shift, to present new challenges that the reduced school system was increasingly unable to address with the systematic thoroughness it had once maintained. And the political environment that had produced the pogrom did not dissipate after it. It settled into a new equilibrium, one in which the witches existed as a tolerated if mistrusted remnant rather than a thriving institution. This is the world that Geralt was made in and for. Not the world the school was built to serve, but the world the school had become by the time his generation came through it. The age of decline, the long slow diminishment of everything the founders had intended. The creature activity on the continent, in the centuries following the pogrom, did not follow the pattern that the continent's comfortable classes hoped it would follow. The hope, articulated by the courtly philosophers of several successive Nilfgaardian and northern administrations, was that the monster problem was essentially a historical one. that the conjunction's legacy was being managed down towards some eventual equilibrium at which the creature population would be small enough and human settlements would be defended enough that the need for specialized hunters would diminish to a level the remaining witches could address without institutional support. This hope was not unreasonable, given the data available to the people expressing it. The creature activity in the settled lowlands, in the immediate vicinity of towns and cities with substantial populations, had indeed declined from the levels of the first centuries after the conjunction. The organized clearing of nests and lairs that the schools had conducted in their operational heyday, the environmental management that reduced the conditions in which certain creatures could breed successfully, the simple pressure of human settlement pushing the wildlands back, all of these had genuinely reduced the density of creature encounters in the continent's inhabited centre. What the comfortable classes did not account for was the perimeter. The frontier zones, the old forests that had never been cleared, the mountain passes and the river marshes and the coastal cliffs where human settlement had not penetrated, were not declining in creature activity. They were maintaining it, in some cases intensifying it, as the creatures displaced from the settled zones relocated to the available wildland and competed for it with whatever was already there. The merchant roads that connected one city to another passed through these zones. The farming villages on the edges of the settled territory lived with their proximity to them. The witches' contracts came primarily from the perimeter, not the centre, and the perimeter was not becoming safer. The mismatch between the comfortable centre's narrative of progress and the dangerous perimeter's lived experience is one of the defining structural features of the Witcher's age. The lords and the scholars and the church functionaries who decided that the Witcher schools were no longer necessary were making that decision from positions within the centre, where the decision felt empirically supported. The villages on the roads and the margins did not get to vote on the question. They simply continued to have the problem, with fewer resources for addressing it, because the resource they had been allocated had been politically delegitimized by people who were not personally proximate to the problem. The contracts that reached the remaining witches in this period reflected the perimeter's reality. They were steady. More than the centre's declining institutional support for the profession would suggest there should be, because the creatures generating them were not declining. They were simply invisible from the centre, as the problems of the periphery always are when the centre has decided to stop looking. There is something worth sitting with in the logic of the Witcher's declining era. The political and religious institutions that had organised the pogrom and had driven the reduction of the schools had done so, at least in part on the argument that the Witcher was no longer necessary. That the world had changed enough that the solution could be retired along with the problem it had been built to solve. This argument was self-serving. It served the Church's interest in removing an autonomous institution that operated outside its moral authority, and it served the political class's interest in eliminating a group of powerful individuals who were obligated to no king. But it was not entirely invented. There was a real sense in which the continent had changed since the founding of the schools. The magical tradition had matured. The alchemical knowledge had spread, at least partially, beyond the exclusive custody of the Witcher schools. Human mages had developed techniques for dealing with some of the creatures that the first generations of witches had encountered with no available assistance. The problem was genuinely smaller in aggregate than it had been at its peak. But smaller is not solved. And the people who make decisions about institutions tend to evaluate necessity in terms of the current moment's visible demands rather than in terms of what the current moment's invisible demand would be if the institution were removed. The church and the political class removed the institutional support for the Witcher schools, watched the reduced Witcher population continue to manage the reduced but not eliminated creature problem, and interpreted the management as evidence that less management was needed. What they did not account for was the direction of the trend. The Witcher population was declining. The creature problem was not. The two curves would eventually cross at a point where the remaining Witchers would be insufficient for the remaining problem, and the crossing would not announce itself with sufficient warning for a new institution to be built in time. Geralt's life on the road in the main saga is lived very close to that crossing point. He takes every contract because every contract represents a real problem in a real place where a real person is afraid. He does not have the luxury of prioritizing, of triaging the urgent from the merely serious, because there are no other Witchers available to take the merely serious contracts, and there are not enough contracts available to support more than the most basic maintenance of his existence. He is one of a handful of people performing a function the world was built to require, in a world that has decided the function is no longer necessary. The world is wrong. He knows it. He continues anyway. The road in the Witcher's Age has a specific texture that deserves to be inhabited for a while. The merchant roads between the continent's cities and towns are not the ordered infrastructure of an empire at its administrative peak. They are the accumulated paths of centuries of movement, widened by traffic where traffic is heavy, narrowing to single-file tracks in the sections that pass through forest or marsh, maintained only where the traffic is dense enough to justify the maintenance and left to the weather everywhere else. In autumn, which is the season the road most often presents in the accounts of Geralt's travel, it smells of wet earth and the particular decay of falling leaves compressing under the weight of rain. The mud on the road after a week of rain is not ordinary mud. It is the accumulated residue of everything the road has absorbed over centuries of use: iron filings from the shoes of horses, the oils of wagon axles, the ash of campfires made at the roadside by travellers who needed to stop but had no better shelter, the blood of livestock driven to market, and the blood of men who met each other on the road with hostile intentions, and the blood of creatures that has been encountered at the wrong time by travellers who were not Witchers, and were therefore not equipped to survive the encounter. The taverns that punctuate the road are where the contracts originate for the most part. The alderman or the frightened farmer or the innkeeper himself, who had something coming out of the river or the forest, and who had heard, through the network of rumour and reputation that the Witcher's profession depends on, that there was a man who handled these things, the corner table, the suspicion that arrives before the gratitude, because the gratitude requires the problem to be solved, and the problem is not yet solved. The negotiation of the fee, which is always uncomfortable, and which the Witcher approaches with the professional composure that looks, from outside, like indifference to the negotiation's outcome, but is actually the cultivated stance of a person who has learned that visible need weakens the negotiating position. After the contract, after the creature is dealt with, and the fee has been collected, sometimes in full, sometimes in the reduced amount that the completion of the task and the removal of the immediate necessity produces in the person who had been willing to promise anything before the necessity was removed. After all of this, the road again. The specific loneliness of the road in the declining era, when the Witchers who might once have been passing in the other direction are no longer passing. When the road between contracts is a road that a man walks alone in all weathers, with only the horse and the professional habit of attention to the landscape for company. Roach, whatever horse Geralt was calling Roach at a given moment, the name being applied to the animal in the way that people apply a name to a role rather than an individual, is the constant companion of the declining era's road. The horse does not fear the Witcher. This is notable because most horses fear the Witcher in the way that animals sense things about the humans who approach them and adjust their behavior accordingly, and what the animals sense about the Witcher is the residue of the monster blood and the alchemical compounds that saturate his body chemistry in ways that are not available to ordinary olfactory interpretation. Most horses will not approach Geralt calmly if they have not been trained to do so. Roach, trained and chosen, and habitually referred to in the feminine regardless of the biological reality, was the one relationship in Geralt's daily life that required no management of the ambient hostility problem, because the ambient hostility problem is human in origin, and Roach was not human. Dandelion's periodic reappearances on the road, the bard arriving from whatever comfortable situation he'd been occupying and inserting himself into the Witcher's itinerary with a cheerful assumption that the insertion was welcome, punctuated the loneliness of the declining era with something that the Witcher profession's code had no category for: friendship, in the straightforward sense of a person who enjoys your company and chooses to be in it, is not a category the code addresses. The code addresses neutrality and contracts and the limits of obligation. It does not address what to do when someone likes you, specifically and personally, and makes no secret of it, and the liking is genuine enough that even the reduced emotional volume of the Witcher's mutations cannot prevent the recognition of it. What Dandelion documented about Geralt's road in the declining era, the ballads and the accounts that became the Witcher stories told in taverns across the continent, is the most complete record available of what the life actually looked like from the inside. Not the contracts themselves, which the official records occasionally capture, but the texture of the life between the contracts, the road in the rain, the corner table, the negotiation of the fee, the particular quality of the night on the road when the work was done, and the next thing had not yet presented itself, and the space between was all there was. The ballads are more accurate than they appear. Dandelion was a better observer than he was generally credited for being. Let the road dissolve now, the autumn mud, the rain on the merchant track between one contract and the next, the corner table, Roach's patience at the hitching post outside. There is a particular peace available in the image of the road at night. The fire made at the roadside, the horse settled, the stars above the canopy of whatever forest the night has found you adjacent to. The world very quiet, and the next thing very far away in time, and the present moment requiring nothing beyond the warmth of the fire and the patience of the horse. You're in a version of that peace tonight. The next thing is very far away. The present moment requires nothing beyond the warmth of wherever you are, and the settling of the breath, and the gradual release of whatever the day left in your body. The Witcher is on the road in the telling. You are here. The road goes on. The night is quiet. The fire burns low against the dark. Rest now. The morning will bring what it brings. The night has grown very deep now. You're in the territory that belongs to the hours before the first light, the part of the night that has no colour, only temperature, only the particular quality of silence that arrives when even the last of the nocturnal world has settled into whatever rest the nocturnal world takes. Let this depth be where you are. There is no other place required. The voice is still here, and the history is still here, and we have arrived at the figure who holds all of it together in the specific way that old witnesses hold the history they have survived. Vesemir, the oldest of the surviving witchers, old in the way of things that have been asked to endure so much for so long that the enduring has become their primary characteristic, not merely a quality of his biography, but the thing his biography has been built around, layer by accumulation, until what you are looking at when you look at Vesemir is not merely a man of great age, but a man who is himself a kind of fortress, a repository, the last institution that the wolf school of Kaer Morhen can accurately be said to consist of. He is not sentimental about this. That is perhaps the most important thing about Vesemir, and the thing that is easiest to miss in the accounts that have filtered through into the broader continent's storytelling tradition. He did not choose to become the last keeper of the school's flame because he found meaning in the role of last keeper. He became it because he was there and because he did not leave, and those are different kinds of choosing. Vesemir was at Kaer Morhen before the Pogrom, which means, in the arithmetic of the Witcher's timeline, that he was at Kaer Morhen when it was still a functioning school. When the training yard was full and the library was intact, and the great hall could seat the kind of number that makes a communal meal feel like a community rather than a remnant. He knew that version of the fortress. He trained in it, and was trained by it, and eventually trained others in it, across a span of years that becomes difficult to calculate without losing track of the scale. He survived the pogrom, but the accounts do not agree on how. Some suggest he was away from the fortress on a ranging when the coalition arrived. Some suggest he was present and fought, and the specific quality of his survival was the quality of a man who is very good at surviving the things that kill everything around him, not because he is luckier or better protected than the people he survives alongside, but because he has been doing this for long enough that the instincts for survival have become deeper than thought, operating at a level below decision, below even intention. The kind of survival that happens automatically when everything else has been stripped away. What the accounts agree on is the aftermath. Vesemir in the ruins of Kaer Morhen, in the winter that followed the attack, in the specific quality of cold that the fortress produces when the fires have been out long enough for the stone to have absorbed the outside temperature completely. He would have been the only person in that cold who remembered what the warmth had felt like. The only person in those ruins who knew the difference between Kaer Morhen now and Kaer Morhen before, who had the library's contents in his head as an absence, the way you feel an absence most specifically in the context where the thing that is absent was once present. He stayed. He lit the fires again. He did what was possible to do in the ruins with what was available in the ruins. This is not a dramatic story. It does not have the shape of heroism in the way that the continent's narrative tradition understands heroism. There was no enemy to fight here. There was only the cold and the absence, and the question of whether the thing that had been here was worth the effort of continuing it in whatever diminished form remained possible. Vesemir answered that question in the way that he answered most questions. Not with a declaration or a philosophical argument, but with the next action. He picked up the next piece of wood and put it on the fire. He opened the next door and assessed what was behind it. He began. The philosophy of Vesemir's position, the implicit argument of his decision to stay, is worth examining directly, because it is the most honest argument for the value of continuity that the Witcher saga contains. It is not an argument made in words. It is an argument made in decades of getting up in the morning in a cold and ruined fortress and continuing to do the thing the fortress was built for, with less of everything than the fortress was built to contain. The argument is this: the knowledge matters more than the institution. The institution, the physical fortress, the fully staffed school, the library with its complete bestiary, the training programs running at capacity, all of this was the delivery mechanism for the knowledge. The mutations and the formulae and the field reports and the hard-won understanding of how the post-conjunction creatures behave in specific conditions and what kills them efficiently, and what the signs of their presence are before the presence becomes a crisis. That knowledge, accumulated over centuries of operational practice, is what makes the Witcher useful. The institution was the vessel. But the knowledge that Vesemir carried in his memory and his notes and the surviving fragments of the looted library, the knowledge could be transmitted without the vessel if the person who carried it was willing to stay and transmit. This is a harder position to hold than it sounds. The vessel is what provides the motivation, the community, the shared purpose, the sense of belonging to something larger than the individual practice. These are not incidental to the work of an institution. They are what makes the work sustainable over time. A person maintaining a tradition alone, in ruins, without the reinforcement of communal practice and institutional identity, is doing something that requires a particular quality of motivation that does not depend on any of those things. A motivation that comes from inside, from some deeper identification with the purpose itself, rather than with the community that serves the purpose. Vesemir had this motivation, clearly, but he was also, from the accounts, deeply practical about it. He did not romanticize his position. He did not perform the tragedy of the last guardian for the benefit of anyone watching. He assessed what was possible, continued what was possible, and waited with the patience of a man who had outlasted several kingdoms already for the world to send him what the world eventually sent him, the survivors and strays and damaged goods of the continent's other disasters who would become the next generation of the Wolf School's witchers. Lambert arrived angry, Eskel arrived wounded, Geralt arrived with the particular quality of self-containment that the trial of the grasses was still early enough in him to look like coldness, rather than the earned composure it would become. Vesemir looked at all of them, in their various states of damage and difficulty, and he began teaching. The relationship between Vesemir and Geralt in the saga has the quality of something that formed over too long a period to be easily described by any single word. Father is the word the narrative sometimes reaches for, and it is not wrong, but it is also not quite right, in the way that the words available for relationships formed in unusual circumstances are rarely quite right. Vesemir is the person who made Geralt what he is, in the most literal sense, who administered the mutations, who supervised the training, who calibrated the process that turned whoever Geralt was before Kaer Morhen into the specific witcher that Geralt became. That is a kind of making that exceeds what most words for it contain. The dynamic between them in the accounts is not the dynamic of warmth expressed freely. Vesemir does not embrace easily. He does not offer comfort in the words of comfort. What he offers is competence, the steady, specific, demonstrable competence of a man who's been doing the necessary thing for longer than anyone else alive, and who continues to do it without requiring acknowledgement of the doing. When Geralt returns to Kaer Morhen in the winters, Vesemir's welcome is a hot meal, a functional room, and the available company of a person who has known him for longer than anyone else in the world. This is more than it sounds like. In the training of Ciri, Vesemir's specific quality became most visible. She was not a boy brought through the usual channels. She was not the expected material. She arrived at the school at an age when the trial could not be safely administered, with a power that the school's existing knowledge did not fully account for, at a moment when the school had even less institutional capacity than it had had in the generation before. And Vesemir taught her anyway. He taught her the pendulum, the signs, the basic alchemy, the monster ecology. He gave her what the tradition could give at this stage of her development, with what the tradition had available at this stage of its survival. The care visible in that teaching is not performed. It does not announce itself, but it is present in the specifics, in the patience of the approach, in the calibration of the difficulty to what she could actually achieve, rather than what the curriculum would have demanded of the expected material, in the particular quality of attention that Vesemir brought to her training, which was the attention of a man who understood that this might be the last Witcher-adjacent training that Kaer Morhen ever produced, and who was therefore determined that it be done as well as the circumstances allowed. Geralt's return to Kaer Morhen after the events of the main saga, after Ciri has been found and trained and placed on whatever trajectory her elder blood and her choices will eventually determine, has in it the quality of a man returning to the one place in the world where the question of who he is does not need to be answered before entry is granted. The rest of the continent requires at every door some version of the explanation. At Kaer Morhen, the explanation is not needed. The fortress knows what he is. Vesemir knows what he is. The training yard knows what he is because the training yard is in part made of the years he spent in it. Yennefer's relationship to Kaer Morhen is the relationship of a person who arrives from outside a long-established intimacy and must find her place within it without having the history that gives the intimacy its texture. She is not unwelcome, but she is also aware, in the specific way that people who pay close attention to social environments are always aware, that what is in Kaer Morhen runs deeper than she has access to, that the silences between Geralt and Vesemir in the Great Hall contain a history she was not there for, and that the history is the real conversation, and the spoken words are the surface of it. Lambert's anger in the surviving accounts is the anger of a man who has made peace with very little of what was done to him, and what was lost by him in the process of becoming what he is. He did not choose Kaer Morhen in the way that Geralt arguably chose it, the law of surprise having complicated the question of what choice looked like in Geralt's arrival. Lambert was there because he was there, and the bitterness of that distinction is something he carries with the consistency that the other witches have in their own ways, resolved or suppressed or metabolized into something more workable. Vesemir watched all of them. That is, in the end, the thing that most defines him, the watching, the being there to watch, the extraordinary, specific, unrepeatable fact of a man who'd been there before the pogrom and who was still there, watching, in the decades that followed it, when the people who had destroyed the school had long since gone to their own endings, and the school persisted in its diminished and tenacious form, because he had declined to let it end. Let Vesemir settle into you gently now, not as a lesson, not as a message about persistence or resilience or the duty to continue, just as a presence. An old man in a cold fortress who lit the fires again after the fires had been put out and kept them burning and was still there to receive whoever needed warmth. There is something in that image that belongs to the deepest part of the night, the part you're in now, the fire that keeps burning because someone decided it would keep burning, the warmth that is available because someone chose to maintain it. You are in warmth tonight. You did not build the fire. You're simply near it, which is enough. Let your breathing be very slow now. Let the image of the fortress in the mountain dark be the last thing behind your eyes before the images stop and the rest begins. Vesemir is keeping his watch in the telling. You're keeping yours here, in the warmth, at the edge of sleep. Rest. The fires are lit. The fortress holds. We have arrived at the end of the history, not the end of the story. The story continues, in the books not yet written, and in the imagination of everyone who has walked the continent in their reading and has not quite managed to leave it. But the end of what we've been carrying together through this long night, the conjunction that started it, the monsters it seeded, the mages who decided a solution was possible, the fortress where the solution was built, the code that governed the solution's conduct, the hatred that accumulated around the solution's strangeness, the violence that tried to end it, the decline that succeeded where the violence failed, almost, and Vesemir, old in the ruins, keeping the fires burn for the generation that would follow him. One breath in, one breath out. Let it be very slow, this last breath before we arrive at the end. You've been in this history for a long time tonight, and the history has been settling into you in the way that all things settle, in the hours between midnight and morning, without effort, without retention, simply becoming part of the deep background of you. What comes next is the conclusion of everything the history has been building toward, not the conclusion in the sense of a resolution, because the story of the witches is not resolved. It is ongoing, it is contested, it is still being written in the books that George R.R. Martin has not yet written, and in the games that continue to add to the continent's geography. But the conclusion in the sense of what the history has been saying, through all its specific events, about the larger question of what it means to be necessary in a world that has decided you are not. Geralt of Rivia is a witcher who did not start with that surname. He was born without a name the history has preserved. The child delivered to Kaer Morhen under the law of surprise, whose mother relinquished the claim she held on the surprise in the same breath, leaving him to the fortress in a way that the fortress, in its operational years, was accustomed to receiving such relinquishments. He chose the name Rivia later, for reasons that are partly practical and partly the kind of mild irony that a man with a witcher's emotional range expresses in place of the more dramatic forms of self-expression that remain above his current emotional register. He chose the name in the way that all witches chose names, from places, from the geography of the continent, in the tradition of a school that had decided somewhere in its earlier centuries that the names brought from before were the names of the lives that the oath and the mutations had ended, and that the new life required a new name rooted in the world the new life would be spent in. Geralt of Rivia, Lambert of Dennesley, Eskel, whose surname the accounts do not consistently record, Cohen of Povis. The Wolf School. Witches named for places they had passed through, places they had worked near, places that had given them contracts they remembered for one reason or another. What Geralt of Rivia became, over the course of the saga, is something that the saga's own genre makes complicated to describe without resorting to the language of the very narrative traditions the saga is in dialogue with. He is not a hero in the traditional sense. He resists the designation consistently, and with the particular weariness of a person who has watched the designation be applied to people who did not deserve it, and who does not want to be on that list. He is not a villain, though he makes choices that serve villainous functions in specific contexts, as the code's neutrality occasionally requires. He is a professional in the most serious sense of the word, a person who has been made into a tool for a specific function, and who has, over several decades, developed a relationship to that function that is deeper than professionalism and more honest than vocation. He is also, in the way that the saga most insistently presents him, a person, with the specific relationships and the specific griefs and the specific habits. Roach's name, the coin toss that makes decisions the profession does not make for him, the particular quality of his attention to Dandelion's ballads that looks like disinterest, and is actually something closer to the careful attention people pay to things they do not want to appear to care about too visibly, that constitute personhood even when the mutations have reduced the volume of its more dramatic expressions. The law of surprise that bound Geralt to Ciri is one of the oldest folk magic traditions on the continent. You saved my life. What you find at home that you didn't expect is mine. The tradition predates the Witcher schools, predates the conjunction, potentially predates the elves in the form that the surviving elven records know it. It is the continent's way of acknowledging that some bonds are prior to intention, that some obligations precede the decision to be obligated, that the universe sometimes creates debts between people before either of them has signed anything. Geralt did not take the law of surprise because he wanted a child. He took it in the particular way that people accept terms they are not reading carefully because they do not expect them to be invoked, as a kind of courtesy, a traditional closure to a transaction that the tradition required to be closed in a specific way. He was surprised when it was invoked. He was then more surprised by his own response to the invocation, which was not the resignation of a man accepting an unwanted obligation, but something that the mutations had not eliminated from his emotional range even at their most effective, something that functioned, in all the relevant ways, as recognition. This is worth pausing on in the specific context of everything we have been discussing tonight. Geralt, who was made sterile by the same process that made him capable of doing what he does, who was made unable to have children in the biological sense as a direct consequence of the transformation that made him a Witcher, who therefore carries in the most intimate possible register the cost of what the schools did to him. This person, encountering the child that the law of surprise has bound to him, feels not resentment of the obligation, but something in the direction of relief, as if the thing the mutations took from him was not, after all, entirely beyond recovery, as if the universe, which had been fairly brutal about what it required of him, was offering a form of restitution through a legal mechanism from the pre-conjunction folk tradition. The relationship between Geralt and Ciri, which is the relationship between the last of the Witchers and the person who carries in her blood the power of the Elder Blood, who is trained in Kaer Morhen's ruins by the school's last generation, who becomes something the school did not produce and did not anticipate, is the saga's central argument about what survives when institutions end. The institution of the Wolf School ended at the Pogrom. What survived was the knowledge and the people who carried it, and what those people could give to the one they chose to give it to was not the school, but the school's meaning, not the fortress, but the function, not the history, but the capacity the history produced. Ciri, who carries the elder blood of the Aen Seavern, the knowing ones among the elves, is the continent's oldest legacy encountering its most recent institution. The power in her blood predates the conjunction. It is a form of relationship to the structure of reality that the elves had cultivated for eons before the spheres collided and deposited the monsters and the humans and all the subsequent chaos into the world the elves had been carefully tending. She is, in the deepest genetic sense, older than the Witchers, older than the Wolf School, older than Kaer Morhen. Her capacity to move between worlds, the power that the wild hunt pursues her for, the power that makes her destiny in the saga's vocabulary, is the return of something the conjunction briefly made available to the world, and then, in closing the spheres, withdrew. The training she received at Kaer Morhen grafted the Witcher's practical methodology onto the Elder Blood's cosmic power, in a combination that the schools had never been designed to produce. She learned the pendulum and the signs from Geralt and Vesemir and Lambert and Eskel. She learned the road from Geralt's side of it, through encounters the saga narrates in the specific texture of a man learning, in middle age, what it means to be responsible for someone other than himself. She is not a Witcher. She is something the Witchers made possible without being able to have made intentionally. The sword she eventually wields, Zuriel, the swallow, the elven blade that is named for her in the language of the people whose blood she carries, is another braiding of the deep past and the Witcher present. The elven metallurgy that produced blades of the quality that Zuriel represents predates the continent's human metalwork by millennia. The skill to use it that she developed in the ruins of the Wolf School's training yard is the Witcher tradition's contribution. She carries, in the sword and in her body, and in the combination of what she was born with and what she was taught, the synthesis of everything that the post-conjunction world produced and then nearly destroyed. Yennefer, who chose to be the closest thing to a mother that Ciri would have in this version of her life, brings to the synthesis the mage tradition's perspective, the centuries of accumulated magical knowledge that the Brotherhood of Sorcerers represented, filtered through the consciousness of a mage who had her own difficult relationship to what her transformation had taken from her. The three of them together, Geralt, Yennefer, Ciri, are the continent's three surviving traditions in their most distilled form: the Witcher, the Mage, the Elder Blood. Three responses to the conjunction, 3,000 years apart, finding each other on the road between Rinda and somewhere else. The world of the Witcher saga, at the point where the books most recently leave it, is a world that has been permanently changed by the events of the main narrative, and that is in the process of being changed again by the events that the final books will eventually describe. The continent is not the same continent it was when we entered it through the lens of the conjunction 15 centuries before the saga. The Nilfgaardian Empire is reshaping its political geography. The Lodge of Sorceresses is attempting to rebuild the mage tradition in a new configuration. The Witcher schools are at the lowest ebb of their entire history. And Ciri, wherever she is in the unwritten chapters, is the person who carries most completely what the entire history of tonight has been building toward. She is the answer to the question the conjunction posed. Not a solution. The monsters are still there. The post-conjunction ecology is still operating. The problems the schools were built to address are still problems, but an answer in the deeper sense, evidence that the world that the conjunction created, which tried so many times and in so many ways to destroy the things it needed, had not succeeded. That what was necessary had persisted. That the knowledge had passed from the founders to the Pogrom survivors, to Vesemir, to Geralt, to her, and that what she would do with it was still to be determined, but that it would not be nothing. Geralt, at the end of the accounts we have access to, is a man who has survived everything the continent tried to do to people like him: the prejudice, the contracts that paid too little and cost too much, the road in all weathers and the corner table in all taverns, the losses of colleagues, of the school as it was, of the ordinary life that the mutations and the code had permanently placed out of reach. He has survived all of this not by being invulnerable to it, but by continuing. By getting up in the morning on the road and going toward the next thing, which was usually the next contract, but which was sometimes the next version of a relationship he had decided was worth more than the code's neutrality strictly permitted. He is, in the end, the answer to a question the world of the Witchers keeps asking about itself. What does it take to be what you are, in a world that has decided what you are is not wanted? The answer, in Geralt's case, is everything. And the answer is worth it. If sleep has found you now, let it take you all the way. Subscribe before you drift. The next story is already waiting. Come back when you are rested. The continent will keep. The history is complete for tonight. The conjunction that started everything. The monsters it left behind. The mages who made the witches to deal with what the conjunction left. The fortress on the mountain. The code and the contract. The roots of the hatred and the violence that hatred eventually became. The decline. the last master in the ruins, the girl with the elder blood learning the pendulum in the ruined training yard of a school that was not supposed to be there anymore. You have been carrying all of this with you through the long hours, and now you may set it down. It will be here tomorrow, patient and unchanged, the way all histories are patient and unchanged. The story does not require your vigilance to persist. It persists on its own. Let your breathing go completely. Let the room around you be simply the room around you, warm, dark, quiet. Not the continent, not the mountain, not the road. Here, now. Your breath, the dark, the rest. The history keeps, the story holds, and your watch for tonight is ended. Sleep well, and if you enjoyed travelling through this history tonight, tell me where in the world you're watching from. I always love to know who keeps the watch alongside us. The next story is already waiting in the archive. Until then,